We will now interrupt your regularly scheduled programming for this Good Old Blades micro podcast.
You've probably heard a lot of knife makers say to treat abrasive like it's free. And although I'm going to disagree, all right? Because everybody knows that abrasive is not free. Abrasive is probably one of the most expensive components of knife making, next to raw materials and your time. And I think that we need to pivot that mentality a little bit, because there are certain operations within knife making that require fresh abrasive, all right? Like your final finishes on blades, specifically the bevels and various other operations. The freshest belts produce the cleanest work. However, just because that belt has been used very, very few times for that operation does not mean it is worthless. For instance, I might go ahead and use a fresh, I don't know, if I'm putting an as-ground finish on a bevel, I might use a fresh 220 grit belt. Once that's done on the bevel, I will use that typically to either sharpen my blades, put the initial bevel on the blade, or I might use that to get a 220 grit finish on my handle material, and so on and so forth. The belt itself doesn't automatically get chucked just because I've used it for one operation. However, there's also a stratification of abrasive cost, right? Ceramics and structured abrasive belts and things like that cost the most per belt. So those are probably going to be your highest cost. However, you can do initial rough grinding on a 50 grit belt, a ceramic belt, and you can do quite a few blades with it if you're running it properly. So if you're running it at high speed and high pressure, you can burn through, figuratively speaking, don't burn your blades, but you can burn through a bunch of blades with a single ceramic belt. You can finish quite a few blades with a structured abrasive belt. But as the backing gets thinner, so like if you're using a J weight and it's thinner, it has more pliability, and so I noticed that the abrasive medium might fracture off of the belt a little bit easier than, let's say, on an X weight. There are certain considerations that you make there, but the idea is don't treat abrasive like it's free, because you will end up getting into a mentality where you waste money when you don't need to. Think of a belt and abrasive in general as an expensive component of your making. However, you can break it apart into certain operations to get the most bang for your buck. Now, there are plenty of abrasives that I do treat with the kind of mentality where it's free, or it's a cheap material, just go ahead and move to the next piece or whatever, and that's in hand sanding. So I use Indasa's Rhino Wet right now, and I've found that to probably be some of the most stable until you get up in the high grits, and then honestly there's not a lot of cutting performance differences between abrasives that I've seen. Everyone wears out approximately the same. Because of that, what I will do sometimes is I will switch to stones. So Gesswein stones are really great. They are abrasives, right? They are stones, but they're still abrasives. And you can get different Gesswein stones, Gesswein, in order to stone your materials, like they're EDM stones and tool and die maker stones. And so when you get to a certain grit pattern, you can use stones in order to knock all the high points off, and then you can go to, I don't know, like other 400, 600, 800, 2000, whatever grit finishes higher up, where stones kind of top out at maybe 1500 to 2000. just because they become brittle. I mean, you can get thick ones, but they lose, their cutting power. From what I have experienced around the 1500 to 2000 mark. So if you're doing mirror polishes and things, you might want to continue with 2000, 2500, and 3000 grit sandpaper for your pulls and everything before you go to a polish. But the idea is that with hand sanding, and you cut up smaller pieces of abrasive material and you run through those, and rather than sit and wait for the sense that this thing is not cutting well anymore, I would just before that happens, figure out what your standard stroke count is or whatever per blade steel type that you're using, and just chuck it. Like, don't try to nurse every inch of usability out of a piece for the sake of saving a penny. Try to cut your pieces up, you have them in manageable pieces, and use it as well as you can. But if it stops cutting, or right before that, just go ahead and throw it and start a new piece. So belts get the highest priority of my attention because they're so expensive. And hand sanding, the abrasive collectively, like from Indasa, books of sandpaper cost, I don't know, maybe between $20 and $50, and you're getting quite a few sheets. Out of those, I cut them on a one of those old guillotine style paper cutters, and from there I will organize them out according to grit, and I will progress up the grits. So if I'm doing a 50 grit finish off the grinder, I will typically go up to at least 220 grit, maybe 400 grit on the grinder before I ever do any type of hand sanding work. And if I'm being honest with myself, and I'm being honest with you listeners, I would try to do as much on the grinder as possible. It is a piece of machinery that you've paid a lot of money for. If you have the ability to be sensitive with your touch, and you can go higher on the grits there, you will save yourself a lot of trouble with hand sanding, because if you can get up to a 600 grit finish on the grinder, and then you're going and doing hand sanding, you might be able to start at 400 on hand sanding and get rid of all of your opposing lines, and then move up the grit structure from there. But if you start at 80 grit or 120 grit on the grinder and you automatically go to hand sanding, you will hate yourself. So use your tools appropriately. In abrasive, my standard is I use a 50 grit ceramic, I use 120 grit ceramic, and then everything else I do is an aluminum oxide. So I'll go to 220, 400, 600, and sometimes 800. And then I have structured abrasive that I use, like the Gator belts sometimes, and then I'll also use micron belts depending on how high I'm thinking I'm going to go. But the idea, at least, is that aluminum oxide are pretty cheap. You can get those for maybe a little over $2 a belt, whereas the ceramic ones are between $7 and $11 a piece, depending. There's some places that I've paid $15 for, but that was when I first got started. And you can purchase them in bulk and get a discount on them as well. Idea, at least, being abrasive is not free. Don't treat it like it's free. Figure out the operations that you can use it on to get the most out of it, but don't sacrifice the quality of your work and the usability of the abrasive because you want to cut corners or save a dime. The idea, at least, is you want clean, well-cut lines, and that requires fresh abrasive. And in other operations, you might not need that same thing. You might not need it to have the quickest cutting. Now, for desert ironwood, I have to have really well cutting abrasive the entire time because it's super hard. And anything less and the heat that's generated, it will burn it up. And it smells like kind of like popcorn. And then I have to just go back down and resand it and everything. So the idea at least is treat your abrasive not like it's free. Treat it like it costs a lot of money and you need to get the most out of it. Target your belt rotations according to how you're going to be utilizing your blades or your belts, and always make sure that the operations that need to be the cleanest, need to have the sharpest lines, are the things that you're using the first of the abrasives on. Another idea or tip is on abrasives that are ceramic, they have a lot of peaks and valleys, all right? And when they come from the manufacturer. What I recommend is that if I'm doing a 50 grit or a 36 grit on a ceramic, I will knock the tops of the abrasive off with a piece of steel. Just run it through it quick, on the surface of the belt, just to knock those ones off, because you will get the grit of the belt on those peaks, and they can dig pretty deep. So if I'm using a 36 grit, I might actually experience that I have some scratches that are 24 grit, or maybe a little bit higher than that, but still not 36. The same thing happens with 50 grit. The very tops of that ceramic need to be knocked off, otherwise you're not getting a homogeneous 50 grit finish. So food for thought. Don't just listen to everybody who has a lot of extra disposable income. There are very cost-effective ways for you to be able to buy abrasive and to utilize those, and you don't have to break the bank. But you just have to be conscious that it is a real investment. Like everything in knives, it's not free. It can be an expensive hobby and or an expensive career, because of the return on investment that you have to consider with how much you put into your knives. So just, be aware of those things. Be kind, and I hope this helps.